What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. The last few years in many Western countries have been characterized by a growing sense of bewilderment, anger, and distrust. Distrust in mainstream institutions, in each other, and in ourselves, in our own capacity to apprehend reality and come to consensus about the nature of the world around us. What's driving this shift and the forces that have conspired to break consensus reality is the subject of today's conversation with my guest, Jon Askonas. Jon and I spend the first hour of our conversation discussing the sources of this fragmentation, the disembodied self, and the ways in which the modern age shares more in common with the enchanted world of the Middle Ages than it does the secular age that has defined consensus reality in the Western world for most of the last 500 years. In the second hour, which is available to premium subscribers, we look at the pervasive effect of social media on the news business, the problem of truth and how to find it in this world of fractured realities, and what needs to be done and can be done in order to begin to address the problem. You can find related podcasts to this one on this week's episode page at hiddenforces.io, where you can also access the second part of today's conversation by joining one of our 3 content tiers. This gives you access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the second part of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this deeply insightful and enlightening conversation with my guest, Jon Askonas. Jon Askonas, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure having you on, Jon. We were introduced by a mutual friend, Luke Burgess, who I've had the pleasure to get to know over the years since he was last on the podcast. And he has described you as something analogous to an intellectual sounding board, sparring partner. It's always great to have people like that in your life. And if Luke thinks that you play that role for him, then that's all I needed to know to have you on the podcast. But you also write a lot of very interesting things, and you're writing a series recently for the new Atlantis, which is, the title of the series is What's Happened to Consensus Reality, I believe. And you've released 2 pieces that I've read. I don't think you've released a third one yet. We're going to get into all of that. That's kind of why you're here, the subject that you explore in the new Atlantis. But before we do all that, I'd love to know a little bit more about you, because it looks like you have a background in international relations. You teach at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C. So how did you kind of get to where you are today? What's your deal?
Yeah. So after I went to Georgetown for undergrad and was always interested in, maybe I read too many Tom Clancy novels as a kid, was always interested in what was going on in the world and in the intersection of kind of technological change, globalization, and the new world of the post-Cold War period. And so that led me in a lot of different directions. I studied Russian. It was at a time when most of my friends and colleagues were studying Mandarin, they were studying Arabic, and Russia was supposed to be kind of down and out. And I thought that, if you can predict one thing about history, it's never count Russia out. This is in the late 2000s, early 2010s. Yeah, back when Russia was not on a lot of people's radar.
And it was late enough that all the students that were studying Arabic and looking to become experts on the Middle East were kind of pivoting to Asia.
Yeah, that's right. So, the smart ones were pivoting to Asia, right? And there's, we can talk about mimesis later. I know that's something Luke and I have talked a lot about. But, one of the smart things I did at the time was to try to be a little bit anti-mimetic, to kind of look where everyone was going and go the opposite direction. And so, but I also, in my study of the Russian language, living in Russia, learning and thinking about Russian history and politics, I came to see Russia as a really interesting case of technological change as well. If you look at the transformations that Russia underwent in the 20th century, they're really emblematic of changes that affected almost every country on earth to take into extraordinary extremes, extreme development, extreme political, social transformation. And so those are some of the themes that I was interested in. But I never wanted to just be an ivory tower academic. I always kind of wanted to get my hands dirty a little bit as well. So I worked at Embassy Moscow for a little bit in the economics section. I started a data analytics startup when I was at grad school in the UK, follow-up care, doing post-operative monitoring of dental and medical patients. And that sort of led me to the things that I work on today. So my academic work is more on military innovation and kind of geopolitics and technology. But I also became interested in contextualizing the transformations that we're all living through in a kind of historical perspective. And I came to feel that some things we were experiencing, like social media, we were probably taking we weren't viewing it in a long enough historical perspective. But I think the overarching change of confronting the internet as a new form of human communication, we actually probably don't make a big enough deal about it. I think even 20 years on from most people getting online, we've become too acclimated to it. It's difficult for us to see how transformative it is and how transformative it will be. One analogy I like to use is that the printing press was sort of the proximate cause of the 30 Years' War and the rise of the Westphalian state system. That took over 100 years to happen. So the internet, technology like the internet, has a 100 to 200-year watershed effect.
Is that always true regardless of the nature of the particular technology? So, for example, we know that innovation has been speeding up in the last several decades, driven primarily or starting with Moore's Law and the exponential effect of the microchip, but the compounding effects of microchip technology and the efficiency gains that come from it. But on top of that, now there are other aspects of this sort of combinatorial universe of technology that's driving this doubling even further. Does that factor into it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, and on top of the discrete effects of a new technology, you have the broader problem of a technological society, a society which is, so you have the change and then you have the change in the rate of change, right? I think we've got both of these going on. I mean, even if technological development effectively ceased today or massively slowed down, we would still be looking at, I think, at least 100 years for human society to catch up to the degree of scale in change, in pace, and pattern that the internet has already introduced in terms of global connectivity, in terms of what the internet means for so many different elements of human culture, economic, cultural, religious, political, etc. So now we add on top of that the fact that the internet is not standing still either, that it is itself being affected by the rise of mobile internet, the rise of 5G and very low latency video, and we can add on now generative AI is going to add on top of that. So the answer to your question, I suppose, is both, right? And that's one of the things that's difficult to disentangle about technological change. I do think that sometimes we are too quick to, you and I have talked a bit about this with social media, we're too quick to ascribe to a later technology what is in fact simply the outworking of an older technology that's taken a long ways to kind of get there. That I think is a difficult part of doing this kind of technological analysis.
So social media is a subject that we've covered on the show quite a bit. The first time that I remember reading anyone talking about the effects of social media was probably Nicholas Carr or Sherry Turkle, who wrote a great book, the best book in the early days that I had read, called Alone Together. But in recent years, this has become much more mainstream, an awareness about social media. Shoshana Zuboff played a great role in writing her book, Surveillance Capitalism, but other people have contributed to this. And Tristan Harris has really gone mainstream with this, championing this cause. What I have not been able to find until very recently, I think, is a community that engages with this subject natively, so to speak. So Sherry Turkle, I believe, was a psychologist. I think Nicholas Carr's background was neuroscience. Shoshana Zuboff is kind of a philosopher. I don't really know what you would describe her as, but I've typically found that the people who were interested in this early on were neuroscientists and psychologists. But it never took root within the psychology community or the community of neuroscientists. Where the conversations really seem to be flourishing today are within theological communities, the communities of religious scholars. That's where I seem to find that people are actually having conversations today about what I think is what matters when we talk about social media, which is the effect of social media on the human experience, on what it means to be a human being, on our experience of being a human being in the world, and its effects on our societies, not just on politics, indeed on politics as well, but they're not coming at it from a political lens of how it's what's true, what's not true, and this side is being brainwashed and this side is conspiracy theorists, et cetera, but much more in terms of like, how do we live together as human beings in a world intermediated by these technologies and by what I've described, and I'm curious what you think about this, as a kind of alien intelligence in the world.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's wrong to describe it as a kind of alien intelligence. And, I think a lot of people are interested in these questions. I do think that one advantage that religious traditions might have in thinking about the internet is that, almost by definition, religious traditions don't presume what Charles Taylor called the buffered self, this sort of, that the rationalist individual is both the most important and the most intelligent being on the planet, right? I was thinking about this, I think one of the reasons why the kind of the rationalists, the effective altruists are freaking out about AGI is that they really had a model of the world in which humans sat at the top of the cognitive food chain, right? That is a very recent and a very unique belief about the world, right? Most humans through most of history have not believed that, right? They've had, the kind of classical pre-disenchantment model of the world is a world in which humans exist alongside any number of other kinds of intelligences, many of which were more intelligent than humans, right? I mean, obviously God or the gods, but you also have fairies, you had jinn, you had demons and angels, you had Christians called principalities and powers. So you have this sort of, it's funny, like if you tried to describe the internet to this is a point my friend Michael Sakasis makes quite eloquently in an essay called The Analog City and the Digital City. If you try to explain the world to a kind of enlightenment, an 18th century person, the world of the internet, I think they would find it very alien and very strange, especially because precisely the reason why those concerned about AGI find this prospect so alien and strange. But if you try to describe the internet to a medieval person, they would get it very quickly, right? The idea of messages flying through the air, being carried by daemons, we call them, right? Mailer daemon, right? It's like a demon. The prospect of you being messed with by an algorithm or by, like, these would be trivial everyday experiences to a medieval person or someone from that kind of mindset. So I do think that is one advantage that religious communities have in dealing with this. And in fact, they have a lot of resources, a lot of historical, liturgical, spiritual resources for thinking about a world in which humans are not the only intelligences in play.
I've read that article by Michael. He's brilliant. And I think in that article that you cited, when comparing or when analyzing the work of Charles Taylor, he talks about how in religious communities, the faith of every single member of the community is a source of communal security. Mm-hmm. And this is partly why heresy is so dangerous, because it reduces the collective security. When there's one person in the group who's unfaithful, it reduces collective security in the larger group. And he talks about that in the context of how in the digital city, similar to the Vatican City, so to speak, I don't think he uses that term, but similar to the world of zealotry and widespread theological belief, people tend to be much more tribalistic and much more interested in trying to find tribes, trying to find groups that they can join, in part because it provides a kind of security. And, I think that's fascinating. It's also, I think, interesting, and maybe we can talk about this after you introduce the series that you've been writing about, because I definitely want to get to that. But it'd be interesting to kind of tease out the difference between having this sense of being part of a larger whole and engaging in the kind of mystery of lived experience in a fully embodied self versus what we have today, which is this very weird way of being in the world. It's very disembodied. So many of our conversations are scattered. The way in which our brains traditionally work and our memories work are reinforced by being physically present with another person, taking in lots of redundant information in the form of visual cues, and combining that with other aspects to form memories that are much deeper and easier to retrieve. It's much more difficult to do that in a world where you're having these disembodied conversations on various different channels. A lot of times you don't know if you dreamt that you had the conversation. So that's actually a really interesting thread to kind of untangle. Before we do that, please do tell me the series that you've been writing is called What Happened to Consensus Reality. You published an introduction to the series and 2 other pieces, and I don't know what the total number of series is, but tell me what brought this about and what is it about?
Yeah, so the first essay of the series is What Happened to Consensus Reality. The essay series is actually Reality, a Postmortem. So what brought the series about was the feeling, so, spending a lot of time in the political space looking at misinformation, disinformation, and this concern about the concern about what social media, what generative AI was going to do to our shared sense of reality. And the feeling that the people who were engaged in this kind of work were trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That there was something that was irretrievably broken about our sense of reality. And as I kind of dove deeper into this subject, what became clear was that our sense of a strong, shared, universal reality was really an artifact of a really unique technological, political, institutional moment in the 19th and 20th centuries that had really never existed before in human history. And that the internet had broken apart this institutions that generated this really strong shared sense of reality. And that instead of consensus reality, we had entered an era of alternate realities where new institutional structures, new technological affordances allow communities that exist primarily on or are mediated through the internet to bolster multiple different value systems, multiple different ways of understanding the world and being in the world. And that trying to explain how this happened and why this happened and kind of what's coming next is the point of the series. And broadly speaking, it deals with, I've had essays so far on kind of introducing the notion, and particularly the role of the alternate reality game as the epistemic structure of this new way of being in the world. And then we've, essays on the media, essay coming out in the next issue on science and the fact, essays coming out on politics, on conspiracy theories, on economics and the rise of what I'm going to call identity capitalism, and then concluding with the question of kind of artificial intelligence and what this is going to do to our sense of being in the world.
Fascinating. And the AI angle is timely because of ChatGPT and more recently its integration with the Bing search engine.
Yes.
And a specific article that was brought to my attention recently by a former guest of the show who's been on before, who I would love to have on again. Actually, I think it's a good time to have him back on, John Borthwick. And the article was Kevin Roose from the New York Times conversing with Bing and effectively hacking it and getting it to bring out its alter ego. And anyway, let's put a pin in that because we can go down that whole rabbit hole and we will. So you mentioned alternative reality games. I think you mentioned news, but if you didn't, it's relevant. I want to help people understand what you've been writing about so that they don't feel lost in this conversation. The article you wrote about alternative reality games is fascinating, and it's something that I really hadn't considered. I mean, I've always recognized that it was fun to believe in, let's say, conspiracies. And by saying that, I'm not in any way trying to denigrate any particular conspiracy or to even say that I appreciate that term. I think it's also, in a way, it's meant to assail people who believe alternative versions of reality, non-consensus versions of reality. I think it's actually a more appropriate term. And this, Joe Rogan talks about this all the time. He has on people and it's fun. He talks about how it's fun. And that's one of the reasons why he likes Alex Jones. So I've always been aware of that. But what you did in this article was you kind of put together this larger framework to explain what we're doing, partly as a kind of game. And you use the example of QAnon in this way. And actually, I think you also cite a game developer who talked about how he began to recognize in the QAnon story what he was doing as a game developer.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of walk me through that article and what was the argument that you were trying to put forward?
Yeah, so the way to understand something like QAnon is not to assess the truth claims that they're making, not to ask the question of who is Q, is Q a real person or whatever. Just leave that aside for a second. Like, what are they actually doing when they are participating in this QAnon community? And what they're doing is they're telling stories. They're telling stories to each other. They're solving puzzles, right? They have these Q drops that come in on message boards, and then they break them apart. They try to connect them to different facts, right? Then they look in different databases, right? They try to identify GPS coordinates or lines from the leaked John Podesta emails or like number codes, right? And decode, numerological significance in the Q drops and whatnot, right? And where do they do so, right? They do so not so much in person, but online, not really on Facebook and Twitter, actually. Those are almost irrelevant. They do it on Twitch streams, on Discords. They do it on specialized forums. And this creates a number of roles in the Q community, right? Most people are probably passive observers, right? These are the people who are maybe on the Facebook groups just reading posts or on watching Twitch streams, right? And then you have Q influencers, right? And the influencer is a kind of social role in this new epistemic structure. And these are people who actually begin to they build credibility by telling really compelling stories and by drawing attention to stories that other followers have told. And then there's this kind of middle layer, maybe 15, 20% of the community who are kind of the game players, right? They're responding to tweets. They're doing their own research, right? That's kind of the mantra, do the research. Mm-hmm. The research is a way of playing this game, right? And a number of people who in the alternative reality gaming community looked at this and said, this is exactly what we're doing when we're constructing alternate reality games, which is this sort of form of the role-playing game that emerged in the kind of 2000s and 2010s. But what was interesting to me about that was, viewed through that structural lens, that way of engaging with truth goes way beyond QAnon, right? And it's actually just structural to any kind of reality community today. And the reason why is because it's baked into the incentives and affordances that the internet provides, right? And for most people, whether they're talking about QAnon or the Mueller investigation or, the COVID lab leak theories, they can't really do anything. Their theory of what is going on in the world has really nothing to do with what is going on in the world. Most normal people can't actually affect what is actually happening in the world. But they can't affect their mentality towards it. They can't affect their understanding of it. And they can have fun, right? And when we are, and even as an academic or an intellectual or public intellectual like yourself, our incentives when we're online lean towards doing things that are fun, doing things that speak to our community, not necessarily saying the most true thing or the consensus building thing, right? And this is the big shift from the incentives of the news media and mainstream media in the 20th century, is that there were real incentives to build one shared picture of reality and to make arguments within that shared picture of the world. Mm-hmm. And that really breaks down with the demise of advertising-based mass media. So the incentive now is to build a community around a compelling vision of the world and to kind of fit these different pieces of internet and factual sort of detritus into this picture of the world.
I love this emphasis on consensus reality. I think it's so important. Let's take a second to really reflect on that. When I started Hidden Forces, this dichotomy between epistemic truth and ontological truth or ontological reality was very much at the forefront of my mind. Mm-hmm. And I talked about it on the show and with guests and also in monologues. And the basic idea is that what is real is an argument that no one can ever really win or convince anyone one way or the other. There's always reasons to be doubtful. But we can set up a protocol for truth, for fact-finding. And as long as we all agree on the protocol and we agree that it's been followed correctly, we can arrive independently at a consensus view of reality. And that's the world that we've been living in, that you described, that Charles Taylor describes as the secular age, the age between the enchanted world and the digital city that we live in today. What is it about the world we live in today that has assaulted our ability to come to this consensus view of reality independently?
Yeah, that's a great question, Demetri. So when you're running a regression analysis, depending on the kind of boilerplate standard issue, depending on the model you're using, particularly if there's a lot of noise in the data and you have a really large data set, you can actually, there are a number of parameters by which your model will simply not converge, right? The algorithm, which works with a smaller n, ceases to work at a certain scale, right? This is something I deal with directly in the next installment of the series, which is coming out in the next issue of the New Atlantis. I think there's a few underlying characteristics that have prevented our sense of reality from converging when we're using these consensus mechanisms, as you quite accurately describe. The first and most important of them is the superabundance of facts. We're actually just simply generating and making accessible far, far more data, and data that is highly interpretable than has ever existed in the past. So here's an example, right? When JFK was shot in 1963, the amount of primary source information about that event available shortly or at the time or shortly afterwards was very small to the general public, right? If I'm just a member of the general public sitting at home, I can watch on TV and I can get the consensus view, or I can hypothesize and tell various kinds of stories and maybe talk about things that don't really make sense to me. But that's about it, right? My ability to actually investigate any further into this incident is very minimal. And this is why when little kind of chinks in the consensus develop, they're very important. Like this is why the Zapruder film and the grassy knoll was so important to alternative theories of this event, is they were some of the few primary texts that were actually available. If this happened today, within, 15 days, there would be terabytes of primary source information available for anyone to trawl through online. That's the first thing. There'd be dozens of CCTV cameras and iPhone videos and police reports that had been released due to FOIA, body cam imagery, maybe even leaked emails. Okay, so there's this fast trawl of data that counts as facts that suddenly is accessible. And I can, sitting at home in Chicago or San Francisco or whatever, I can go on the internet and find all these primary sources. All right, the second really important element is search, right? The fact that not only does this data exist, I can find it and I can look through it and I can look for the things I want to look for in it, right? So say I'm developing a theory of the grassy knoll. There was actually a second shooter and I think is shooting, I can go on Google Maps and I can find the latitude and longitude coordinates, right? And then I can start to try to find geotagged imagery from that day in Dallas, right? And then I can find inconsistencies or weird things in and around that imagery, right? And I use that to bolster the narrative that I'm already developing even further, right? So you have superabundance effects and you have search. And then the third, I think, really critical thing are the underlying incentive structures. I don't have to do this alone, actually. Other people who are beginning to share my view of this issue, we can find each other on social media. Social media is a search engine for people. It's a search engine for ideas. It'll help the ideas find the most willing participants. It'll help participants find people who share their ideas. And as soon as that happens, not only do I have the additional thrill of sifting through this data, doing the research, but I can actually gain social, in some cases even monetary rewards for my success. If I find a piece of graffiti with numerological significance, picture of it, and I post it to this forum, I'm going to get plaudits and the internet equivalent of applause and kudos from members of this community that I'm beginning to care about, right? And so you have this kind of community formation dynamics entangled with the superabundance of facts and the kind of accessibility of search. You take just those three facts about the internet, and you're in an epistemologically different universe than the world of consensus reality.
So much to pull on there. I want to go back to the Zapruder film. In my estimation, the Zapruder film was a kind of red pill moment for people that may have believed the consensus story in the 1970s and then came across the Zapruder film. And that was their red pilling moment. Now I don't know what the official definition of a red pilling moment, but for me is the way I think about it, having gone through this myself as well, is it's sort of violent, traumatic. It can be oftentimes kind of traumatic, emotionally disturbing experience that you resist at first. And then eventually you succumb to the message. And not only do you succumb to it, but oftentimes you become emotionally wedded to the new reality. And that's what's really interesting and maybe counterintuitive to people about why these alternative views of reality that can be so disturbing. The idea that the government, the intelligence community, the military-industrial complex, Lyndon Johnson, possibly, who knows what all the different actors were involved in the assassination of an American president during the height of the Cold War. That is so disturbing to the reality that held for most people during that time, just like 9/11 conspiracies and what they imply about where power is, your own sense of disempowerment. Something else that's very interesting about many of these alternative models of reality. On the one hand, there's an aspect of them that feels empowering when you're with a community and you're working through this alternative knowledge set and this alternative theory. But at the same time, a world like the one that Alex Jones paints for his audience, and I've talked about this on the show. We had Alex Lee Moyer, a documentarian who did Alex's War, a documentary about Alex Jones. I went down the whole Alex Jones rabbit hole after the 2008 financial crisis. The world that Alex Jones puts forward for his audience is extremely disempowering and depressing. And I find oftentimes people that come out of that sort of religious community are recovering from the darkness of being inside of that. I'd love for you to respond to the process part through which people go from believing in a world that's consensus, where many, many other people in this broad society believe the same thing, to following it down these rabbit holes that are increasingly profuse and also increasingly small and niche in their makeup.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Demetri. And to be clear, I talk about this a little bit in the Reality is Just a Game Now essay, the first essay. I call them red pill moments, and I think there's something structural about them, right? I don't think there's more of them now because the reality has changed or our institutions, media, government, whatever have changed. I think what's changed is your likelihood as an individual of having this kind of experience. And the experience that I describe is one in which something happens in the world. And for whatever reason, you take a personal interest in this, right? It's not just something you scroll through on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and it's like, oh, that happened. You have a personal interest. Maybe you have a family member involved. Maybe it involves an issue you happen to have a lot of expert knowledge in or whatever. And because it's available, you then also begin to explore the issue yourself through, Googling around about it, maybe trying to find some primary sources. And then you look at the media reporting for the issue. And compared to this, your own personal research that you've just done, the media narrative is so completely wrong, so completely off base, that it makes it impossible for you to ever really trust the media again, right? And again, I think there's something really structural about this. That any intelligent person spending time online, sooner or later, is going to have one of these moments about something, right? So one moment for me was early in COVID. I was pretty early to COVID. I became convinced that there was going to be a global pandemic in maybe mid-February based on a number of factors. Following the right Twitter anons definitely was a good early warning system.
Twitter is definitely a place for doom scrolling.
Yes, well, that's right. This time it was correct, though. But really early on, in March or April, there's also the question of origins. Like, where did this come from, right? And there was this letter in Nature that got a lot of play in the media of a bunch of very prominent immunologists or epidemiologists saying this is a natural origin for the virus. And I thought, I took Nature as a very, very serious journal. And I sort of took this seriously. And I didn't really think that much of it for a while. And then, a few things kind of weren't adding up as we were getting more details about the coronavirus. And I began to kind of just do a little bit more digging about this. And I discovered, after 10 minutes of actually researching this, that this letter had been organized by a guy named Peter Daszak, who was the chief person responsible for funding the Wuhan Institute of Virology's gain-of-function research. So it'd be like if immediately after the Kennedy assassination, a bunch of deep state, CIA, FBI people organized a letter, but didn't put their name on it, right? Organized other people, other experts to put their credibility forward saying, oh, this is just Lee Harvey Oswald. This one guy did it, right? Enormously suspicious and not really hidden at all, right? Almost in plain sight. And of course, as we know, it took a year before the mainstream media would even entertain the possibility of a lab leak origin for the virus. And now it seems like the intelligence community has kind of come around to this being the most plausible explanation for the virus. So seeing the kind of, again, this has nothing at all to do with whether the coronavirus actually came out of a Chinese lab. But in terms of my belief about how the media understands the world, the media's accessibility to facts, the media's, the other influences that are shaping what mainstream media is putting out there, it was a hugely red pilling moment for me. And I think anybody, again, at this point, will have, regardless of the political positions or whatever, will encounter one of these sooner rather than later.
Dude, the pandemic was a series of red pilling moments. I mean, there were so many
Absolutely.
opportunities to be red pilled during the pandemic. I have a few thoughts. I want to try to segregate them. One is just a recommendation for people who haven't heard it. Episode 219 with Matt Ridley and Alina Chan was all about this, about the lab leak hypothesis and why it's such a compelling hypothesis. And there's so much corruption around this whole story and so many of the actors that are involved. The other thing that comes to mind when you're talking has to do with the real unknowability of reality, or at least your inability to convert reality into a schema that you can communicate to other people that is 100% reliable and reflective of underlying reality. This brings us back to the problem of the map and the territory. And actually, this is a great opportunity to pull that quote that I mentioned from the book where you talked about how the realm of facts have now exceeded the scope of reality itself. You write, somewhere in the late 20th century, we passed through a strange barrier. The realm of facts began to be bigger than reality itself. The map bigger than the territory. What did you mean when you wrote that? I want to dig deeper into this idea that facts, and what is a fact really? What are we talking about here? Have exceeded reality, that the map is now bigger than the territory. What does that actually mean in reality, and how did that come about? What does that mean for that to have happened?
Yeah, so when we think about the fact, we have in mind this knowledge form that was really invented by Francis Bacon and the scientific revolution in the 16th century, where you submit a little bit of nature to a procedure that allows you to say something definitive about it, right? Bacon refers to it as putting nature to the question. In other words, putting nature on the rack, right? He was his day job, right? He was, among other things, a senior official in the British court. He was familiar with torturing people for information, as the philosopher George Grant points out. And in order to generate these kind of facts about reality, kind of the territory, there was a certain amount of effort, human effort involved, right? Well, with the explosion in sensors, the explosion in networked technologies, the explosion in digital memory, as I think Tim O'Reilly pointed out in your podcast years ago, storage capacity has grown even faster than Moore's law, right? And just in terms of we're now well into the petabytes in terms of thinking about how much stuff we can store. What that means is that we've increasingly cyberneticized, we've increasingly automated the production of facts in such a way that for any given object, we have far more data about that object than the object itself contains, right? When I send you an email, it comes with a train of metadata that is almost always much larger than the actual email. So if you view the email as the kind of the territory of social communication, then the map, the metadata around that email is actually larger than, literally as like a file size, larger than the territory, right? That's true of a lot of different things now. If I have a document, right? If I have a document in my Dropbox, right? I have not only that document, I have version control that gives me 20 previous versions of that same document, right? And then when we add on, if you wanted to do this, with generative AI and whatnot, you could also imagine we could use that document as the initial prompt sequence to generate future versions of that document, right? With different parameters. We could tokenize it in different ways, and we could generate multiple different future versions of the document, right? So taking the fact and then extending it into the past by memory, by the digital archive of the previous states of fact, and then projecting it forward using big data to actually predict future states of fact. That's what I mean by the map being larger than the territory, right? Think about it. If you have a map the size of the territory, right, you have a one-to-one correspondence between the map and the territory. But if you have a four-dimensional map, then you're actually mapping the territory in the past and the future, something that doesn't. The territory itself does not have. The territory just exists in kind of ecstatic temporality. So time is the factor. Moving into the past, moving into the future, moving into other alternate states of a fact, other potential states, all being superimposed on one data object. That's what I mean by the map being bigger than the territory.
So Michael Secasas, who you mentioned earlier, plays with this framing, and I love what he has to say, and I'd love to explore that here. He talks about how it used to be that we would have experiences both in time and space. I think he says both in time and space. of course we do have them in time and space, but that in the world we live in today, the experiences are in time, or that we're in separate spaces, but they're all happening at the same time in different places. That's one interesting fact. This, again, speaks to the disembodied self, and what does that mean? How does that alter the nature of the experience itself? But he also talks about this relationship to the past. Mm-hmm. And in a recent conversation with Chuck Klosterman, Chuck brought up the work of a scholar, I forget his name now. You may have heard the episode. I'm blanking on the guy's name. But he is the progenitor of this thesis around the cancellation of the future. And the whole idea, the base, Mark Fisher, right. And the basic idea that Mark puts forward, as I understand it, is that at some point in the early 2000s, because of the forces that we're describing today, culture ceased to evolve. And we're kind of stuck in this eternal present of culture. I'm curious, one, I'd love to hear how you thought about these things, because I know you have. But I'm also curious to hear what you think about this, which is how I've thought about this in the past. I've thought about this in the context of behavioral modification and behavioral algorithms that target individuals in the world based on the cumulative knowledge they have of that individual and the aggregate set of individuals, and comparing that data to the aggregate. And going from what these algorithms were initially trained to do, which is to become better at predicting your behavior, to increasingly driving your behavior. And they're driving your behavior based on what they know of who you were and what they knew the world to be. And so it seems that the natural progression of such a system is to create a static world which is perfectly predictable. And that is a world which is perfectly controlled. And it feels to me that this is the world that we're moving into. When I talk about an alien intelligence that we're cohabitating with, it is this. It is the machine intelligence that exists in the world, which lives side by side with us and increasingly drives us towards what are, in the present sense, largely the commercial outcomes that it seeks, but really could be anything. They could be political, they could be commercial, they could be anything, but they are ones that hijack our agency, and we live increasingly in a controlled world. I mean, what do you think about those two things? One, the general observations that I put forward, that Michael puts forward, and that Mark Fisher put forward, and then the way that I've just framed it.
Well, I think, for one, I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is the most important thing to understand about machine intelligence. I mean, there's a silly notion, which is really a kind of, people who watch the Iron Man movies too many times, that the important thing about AGI will be this one particular agent that has super intelligence and can do this or that or whatever. And that's completely silly, right? We already have super intelligence. We call them corporations, we call them bureaucracies, we call them nation states. And we increasingly run them with these kind of algorithmic predictive systems, which are quite effective, but they're effective for the reasons you suggest, right? And there is this, look, if every individual truly had kind of ingrained preferences that were unchangeable, then the systems would not have this kind of effect. But as we all know, actually, many of our preferences are quite weak. Many of our preferences develop through mimesis. They develop through training and taste making. And the result of exposing these kind of weak preferences to these predictive systems is homogeneity, is imprinting a kind of static culture on people. And I think this is what Fisher means by the cancellation of the future, right? The future gets canceled because what makes the future interesting or interesting is the ways in which it differs from the present. But at each step along the way, getting to that future depends on a radical departure of some kind from our present situation. And those radical departures can be very easy to kill, right? If you talk to folks at like Y Combinator or in the startup community, they'll say like, one of the most deadly things that you can do as a startup founder is getting too much feedback about your idea, right? If you have a good idea, if you have an idea of a new business or a new product you want to build, and you get a bunch of feedback about it, that feedback is what's going to do. It's going to push you back towards the way things already are, right? And here's the catch, and this is the really tricky thing for people to understand. That feedback is probably actually correct 95% of the time, right? 95% of the time, your business will fail for the exact reasons why somebody who you got feedback from suggested. But all of the alpha, all of the growth, all of the innovation, all the progress is in that 5% that doesn't hold true for. But if you have a system that kills 100% of new ideas or 99%, then you lose out on that 5% as well. right? And you can actually, this is not a descriptive or subjective take. You can actually look at data on new music. And Ted Gioia, the music critic, has actually done this. And it will show that music literally stopped evolving in the 2000s, right? Again, this also goes back to the changes in incentives, changes in business models. But from the rise of mass music in the 1920s until the present, there had been, you can see a steady evolution of kinds of music. You go through waves of jazz, country, rock and roll, like blues, big band, rock and roll, metal. You have these, you can identify these distinct movements. But now there's this quietude over the whole field, and there's just kind of generic pop. And the reason why is because actual communities of artists were linked to labels that were making bets about the future. Most of those bets were wrong, but making those bets drove progress and innovation in music, right? And it was a bet about music finding an audience. But now music, you don't need to bet on music to find an audience. Spotify will help your music find the right audience.
Same thing with Netflix as well.
Netflix, yeah, it's the same thing. It's this.
And in fact, increasingly, the information that Netflix provides to production teams about what their existing audience wants drives the decision-making and budget allocations of the producers.
Absolutely. And here's the thing, right? There's always been a tension between, the Walt Disney and the Roy Disney, right? Between the business side and the artistic side. But at least in the past, the artistic person had the kind of trump card of, well, I'm an artistic genius and you're just a guy in a suit, right? Where now the guy in the suit also has this data. He has an analytics team that says, yes, I have my business argument, but also this is what the data shows about what kind of art is going to succeed. And if you want our money, you're going to have to make art this way, right? Yeah. And that's true across the culture.
Yeah, the rise of all these franchises, especially the Marvel franchises and all the the superhero stuff is indicative of this. I'm going to move us to the second hour, Jon, but before I do, I want to mention a quote which speaks to the entrepreneurial journey that we were just discussing, and it was one that was in Tim O'Reilly's book. You mentioned Tim O'Reilly. That's episode 30, one of our very early episodes, a wonderful episode. At that time, Tim had written a book that was called What the F Happened, something about what the F reality, but it was an exercise in map making. It was a book about how we map the world. And he has this beautiful quote by Tom Stoppard. And the quote is, "A man breaking his journey between one place and another at a third place of no name, character, population, or significance sees a unicorn cross his path and disappear. That in itself is startling, but there are precedents for mystical encounters of various kinds, or to be less extreme, a choice of persuasion to put it down to fancy. Until, my God, says a second man, I must be dreaming. I thought I saw a unicorn. At which point a dimension is added that makes the experience as alarming as it will ever be. A third witness, you understand, adds no further dimension, but only spreads it thinner, and a fourth thinner still. And the more witnesses there are, the thinner it becomes, and the more reasonable it becomes, until it is as thin as reality itself, the name we give to the common experience." That quote, beautiful. It speaks to how an entrepreneur can take a vision that seems insane and make it a consensus view make it reality, make it what everyone believes to be true. It's also how Christianity came into being. It's how every religion came into being. But it also speaks to this notion of consensus reality again, to how we can come to believe things generally to be true, irrespective of whether they are or they aren't. And there's value to that, because when we have a consensus truth, when we have a shared reality, we can organize in space. Human beings need shared stories in order to be able to share information. That's how we operate. So, as I said, Jon, we're gonna move this now to the second hour. Before we do, I want to share one more quote. This one is actually from your writing, and it speaks to something we really haven't had a chance to talk about, but it's what I want to talk about in the second hour, at least spend a lot of our time discussing, which is the news business. And one of the essays that you wrote about is very much focused on this. And here's a quote from it, and we'll follow it up in the second hour. You write, "The unity we felt watching the news unfold on TV gave way to the division we feel watching events unfold online. We all know that social media has played a part in this, but we should not overestimate its impact because the story is much bigger. It is a story about the shifting foundations of reality itself. a story in which you and I are playing along. That actually might have been from the ARG essay, but along with that quote, I also have another one, and this speaks definitely to the news cycle bit, where you write, what we haven't figured out how to make sense of yet is the fun that many Americans act like they're having with the national fracture. So this combines the elements of fun, of ARG, of alternative reality games that we talked about, but it also deals with the very real divisions that are present in society and the dangers that those divisions pose for our ability to sustain ourselves in the physical world, right? So look, Jon, I mean, there are so many places we can go. Sometimes I try to lead the audience ahead of time and let them know, but I think we're just going to continue that conversation in the second hour. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Jon, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Jon, stick around. We're going to move the second hour of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.